The sharp snap of a twig shattered the eerie silence of the snow-covered forest. The jingle of bells clashed with the low, guttural growl that followed, echoing through the icy air. Crimson streaked across the pristine white as a massive shadow lunged from the trees, claws gleaming like blades. The man in red stumbled, the sack of gifts spilling forgotten into the snow. A roar drowned out his screams as the beast descended, its eyes wild with primal fury. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the joyful image of the season twisted into a scene of unrelenting carnage. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Frank Mallory stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his weathered face a canvas of deep wrinkles and sun-worn skin. At 68, he never imagined he'd be considering a job as a mall Santa. The thought made him chuckle, a low, gravelly sound that echoed off the tiled walls. "Well, old man," he muttered to himself, "beggars can't be choosers." He ran a hand through his thinning white hair, remembering the days when it was thick and dark, when he could drive for days on end without feeling the ache in his bones. But those days were long gone, along with his trucking career and the steady income it provided. The sound of the phone ringing in the kitchen pulled Frank from his reverie. He shuffled out of the bathroom, his slippered feet scuffing against the worn linoleum floor. "Hello?" he answered, his voice gruff from years of cigarettes and long nights on the road. "Frank? It's Sarah from the Whitefish Community Center. I'm calling about the Santa position we discussed." Frank's heart skipped a beat. He'd applied for the job on a whim, never really expecting to hear back. "Yes, Sarah, I remember. Well, good news. We'd love to have you as our Santa this year. Can you start this weekend?" Frank hesitated, his free hand unconsciously rubbing the back of his neck. The thought of sitting for hours with screaming kids on his lap wasn't exactly appealing, but the extra cash would certainly help with the heating bill this winter. "Frank, are you still there?" Yeah, I'm here," he said, clearing his throat. "I'll do it. What time do you need me?" Sarah's voice brightened. "Wonderful. Can you come in tomorrow afternoon for a fitting? We'll need to make sure the suit fits properly." After hanging up, Frank stood in his kitchen, the silence of his small house pressing in around him. He glanced at the calendar hanging on the fridge, its pages marked with more doctor's appointments than social engagements. December 15th was circled in red. Bill Day. "Well, Frank," he said aloud, "looks like you're gonna be Santa Claus." The next afternoon, Frank found himself standing in front of a full-length mirror in the mall's back room, decked out in the full Santa regalia. The red suit was a bit tight around the middle. Years of truck stop dinners had left their mark, but overall it wasn't too bad. Sarah, a plump woman in her 50s with a perpetual smile, clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, Frank, you look perfect." Frank tugged at the fake beard, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar sensation. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" "I'm not exactly the jolly type." Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. You've got that twinkle in your eye. The kids will love you." As Sarah fussed with the costume, adjusting the belt and straightening the hat, Frank's mind wandered to his friend Tom and his family. They lived in a cabin just outside of town, and Frank had promised to stop by with some Christmas treats for the kids. "Say, Sarah," Frank said, an idea forming. "What time do you need me here on Saturday? We open at 10 a.m., so if you could be here by 9:30, that would be perfect." Frank nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Mind if I borrow the suit for Friday night? I've got some friends with kids who would get a real kick out of a surprise visit from Santa." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Well, I suppose that would be all right. Just be careful with it, okay? And remember, no smoking in the suit." Frank chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of it." As he drove home that evening, the Santa suit hanging in the back of his old pickup truck, Frank felt a spark of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. The idea of surprising Tom's kids as Santa brought back memories of his own children, now grown and living far away. Friday afternoon arrived, and Frank began preparing for his impromptu Santa visit. He carefully packed a sack with candy canes and small toys he'd picked up at the dollar store. As he donned the red suit, He couldn't help but feel a bit silly. "You're too old for this, Frank," he muttered to himself, adjusting the fake belly. But the thought of the children's faces lighting up kept him going. He checked the address Tom had given him one last time before heading out. The cabin was about an hour's drive into the woods, but Frank figured he had plenty of time before darkness fell. As he drove, the scenery changed from the familiar streets of Whitefish to the dense forests of rural Montana. Snow began to fall lightly, dusting the road and the surrounding pines with a fine white powder. Frank turned onto a narrow dirt road, his truck bouncing over the uneven terrain. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches heavy with snow. As the light began to fade, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," he said aloud, his voice swallowed by the silence of the forest. After what seemed like an eternity, Frank spotted a small clearing ahead. He pulled over, realizing he'd have to walk the rest of the way to the cabin. The forest was too dense for his truck to navigate safely. Grabbing the sack of treats and adjusting his Santa hat, Frank stepped out into the cold Montana evening. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of snow under his boots and the occasional jingle of the bells on his costume. As he trudged through the snow, the weight of the sack and the unfamiliarity of the terrain slowed his progress. The darkness deepened and Frank began to regret his decision. He should have waited until morning, should have asked Tom for better directions. Suddenly the forest fell eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Frank paused, his heart pounding in his chest. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. He turned, thinking perhaps he should head back to the truck and try again in the morning. But as he did, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind him. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then, from the shadows, emerged a pair of glowing eyes. Frank's blood ran cold as he realized the enormity of his mistake. He was alone in the wilderness, dressed as Santa Claus, face to face with a creature that saw him not as a bearer of Christmas cheer, but as prey. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the dense forest surrounding him. The trees, once picturesque in their snow-covered beauty, now seemed to loom ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the fading light. He adjusted the heavy sack of candy and toys on his shoulder, the jovial jingle of bells on his costume a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had fallen over the wilderness. "Get it together, Frank," he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the frigid air. "It's just a little further to Tom's cabin. You've driven cross-country in worse conditions than this." But as he trudged deeper into the forest, each step sinking into the thick snow, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The weight of the Santa suit, once a source of amusement, now felt suffocating. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the biting cold, and he found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder. The forest seemed to grow denser with each passing minute, the trees closing in around him like a natural maze. Frank's breath came in ragged gasps, the exertion of moving through the deep snow taking its toll on his aging body. "Should have stuck to the damn mall," he grumbled, pausing to catch his breath. He leaned against a large pine tree, its bark rough against his gloved hand. As he stood there trying to orient himself, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind him. Frank whirled around, his eyes straining to penetrate the gloom. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small and insignificant in the vast wilderness. "Tom, is that you?" No response came, save for the echo of his own words bouncing back at him from the silent trees. Frank swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, cursing under his breath when he saw there was no signal. "Great idea, Frank. Play Santa in the middle of nowhere. Real smart," he chastised himself. As he stood there, debating whether to press on or turn back, a low, rumbling sound reached his ears. At first he thought it might be his stomach protesting the lack of dinner, but as the sound grew louder, a chill ran down Frank's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a growl, deep, primal, and unmistakably close. Frank's mind raced, recalling all the stories he'd heard about the wildlife in these parts. Bears were common, but they should be hibernating this time of year, shouldn't they? Unless... His thoughts were interrupted by movement in his peripheral vision. Something large was shifting in the shadows, just beyond the reach of what little light remained. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned his head, his eyes widening in terror as they locked onto a pair of gleaming, predatory eyes. There, not 20 feet away, stood a massive grizzly bear. Its fur was a dark, mottled brown, dusted with snow, and its muscles rippled beneath its thick winter coat. The bear's hot breath steamed in the cold air as it regarded Frank with a mixture of curiosity and aggression. Frank's mind screamed at him to run, but his body remained frozen in place. He knew, somewhere in the recesses of his panic-stricken brain, that running would only trigger the bear's predatory instincts. Instead, he slowly began to back away, his movements careful and deliberate. "Easy there, big fella," Frank said, his voice trembling. "I'm not looking for any trouble, just passing through, that's all." The bear tilted its head, as if considering Frank's words. For a brief, hopeful moment, Frank thought it might just leave him be. But then the wind shifted, carrying Frank's scent directly to the bear's sensitive nose. The effect was immediate. The bear's eyes narrowed, and it let out a bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Frank's feet. In that moment, Frank realized with horrifying clarity that the bear saw him not as a jolly Christmas figure, but as a potential meal. Instinct took over, and Frank turned to run. He stumbled through the snow, the jingle bells on his costume now a mocking soundtrack to his flight. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, the sound of the bear's heavy footfalls spurring him on despite the burning in his lungs. "Help!" Frank yelled, though he knew it was futile. "Somebody help me." His foot caught on a hidden root, and Frank went sprawling face first into the snow. The sack of toys flew from his grasp, candy canes and small presents scattering across the forest floor. Frank scrambled to his feet, not daring to look back as he heard the bear closing in. Ahead, Frank spotted a break in the trees, a small clearing. With a burst of desperate energy, he sprinted towards it, praying for some kind of salvation. But as he burst into the open space, his heart sank. The clearing ended abruptly at the edge of a steep ravine. Frank skidded to a halt at the precipice, loose stones and snow tumbling over the edge into the darkness below. He turned his back to the cliff as the bear emerged from the tree line. Its eyes gleamed with predatory intent, its massive jaws opening to reveal yellowed, razor-sharp teeth. "Oh, God," Frank whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Please, not like this." The bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over Frank. In that moment, dressed in his ridiculous Santa suit at the edge of a cliff in the Montana wilderness, Frank Mallory felt smaller and more vulnerable than he ever had in his entire life. Time seemed to slow as the bear brought its massive paw down in a powerful swipe. Frank closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. In his mind, he saw flashes of his life, his children's faces, the open road stretching out before his truck, the simple pleasures of a quiet evening at home. The bear's roar filled Frank's world, drowning out even the frantic beating of his own heart. As the massive paw descended towards him, Frank had one final absurd thought. "I should have just stayed home and watched Miracle on 34th Street. And then the world exploded into pain and darkness as the bear made contact, and Frank Mallory, the reluctant Santa Claus, felt himself falling backwards into the abyss of the ravine, the bear's triumphant roar echoing in his ears as consciousness slipped away. Frank's consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb as he tumbled down the ravine. His body bounced off rocks and crashed through brittle branches, each impact sending shockwaves of pain through his aging frame. The world spun in a dizzying blur of white snow and dark shadows until, mercifully, he came to a sudden stop at the bottom. For a moment, Frank lay motionless in the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence of the forest was broken only by the distant roar of the bear and the faint jingling of the bells on his now tattered Santa suit. As the adrenaline began to ebb, pain flooded his senses. "Jesus," Frank groaned, slowly pushing himself up onto his elbows. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and took stock of his surroundings. He had landed in a small clearing at the base of the ravine, surrounded by dense trees and steep rock faces. The moon, now fully risen, cast an eerie glow over the snow-covered landscape. Frank attempted to stand but immediately collapsed back into the snow with a sharp cry of pain. His left ankle was definitely sprained, possibly broken. He could feel warm blood trickling down his face from a gash on his forehead, and every breath sent stabbing pains through his ribs. "Well, Frank," he muttered to himself, "you've really done it this time." As he lay there, trying to gather his strength, a sound from above made his blood run cold. The bear was making its way down the ravine, its powerful form easily navigating the treacherous slope. Frank's heart raced as he realized his predicament. Injured, trapped, and now face to face with a predator that saw him as nothing more than prey. The grizzly emerged from the shadows, its massive form blocking out the moonlight. It stood on its hind legs, towering over Frank, its hot breath visible in the frigid air. Frank could see every detail of the beast, its matted fur, the scars on its muzzle, and most terrifyingly, its razor-sharp claws and teeth. "Nice bear," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good bear. You don't want to eat me. I'm all gristle and tough meat. Probably give you indigestion." The bear dropped back to all fours, its head low as it began to circle Frank. Its eyes never left him, filled with a primal hunger that sent shivers down Frank's spine. He knew he had to do something, anything, to try and save himself. With trembling hands, Frank reached for the sack of candy and toys that had miraculously stayed with him during the fall. He fumbled with the drawstring, acutely aware of the bear's every movement. "Here," Frank said, tossing a handful of candy canes towards the bear. "How about some peppermint? It's good for the digestion." The bear sniffed at the candy, then swatted it away with a powerful paw. It let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Frank's mind raced, searching for anything he remembered about bear encounters. "Make yourself big," he muttered. "Yell. Make noise." Summoning what little strength he had left, Frank pushed himself up to a sitting position. He spread his arms wide, trying to make his red-suited form as large as possible. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the ravine walls. "Get out of here! Go on, get!" The bear hesitated for a moment, seemingly startled by Frank's sudden change in demeanor. For a brief, hopeful second, Frank thought it might actually work. But then the bear's eyes narrowed and it let out a roar that shook Frank to his very core. In that moment, as the bear reared up on its hind legs once more, Frank saw his life flash before his eyes. He thought of his children, grown now with families of their own. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, and wondered if he might be seeing her soon. He thought of all the miles he'd driven, all the sunrises and sunsets he'd seen from behind the wheel of his truck. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Frank whispered as the bear's massive form blocked out the moon. "I should have listened to you and retired to Florida." As the bear's paw came down in a powerful swipe, Frank closed his eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of the expected pain, he heard a loud jingle. His eyes snapped open to see the bear pawing at the Santa hat that had fallen from Frank's head, the bells on its rim tinkling merrily. An idea struck Frank with the force of a lightning bolt. With shaking hands, he quickly removed the belt from his Santa suit. It too was adorned with small bells that chimed with every movement. "Hey, big guy," Frank called out, jingling the belt. "You like that sound? How about this?" The bear's attention snapped to the belt, its eyes following the movement. Frank began to swing the belt in a wide arc, the bells creating a cacophony of sound that echoed through the clearing. The bear tilted its head, seemingly entranced by the noise and motion. Seizing the moment, Frank used his good leg to push himself backwards inch by agonizing inch. The snow crunched beneath him as he moved, but the bear remained focused on the swinging, jingling belt. Frank's back hit something solid, a fallen tree, half buried in the snow. Using it for support, he managed to pull himself up to a standing position, his injured ankle screaming in protest. All the while he kept the belt moving, the bells ringing out in the still night air. "That's it," Frank said, his voice a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Just keep watching the bells. Nothing to eat here. Just a crazy old man in a red suit." As Frank inched his way along the fallen tree, the bear suddenly shook its massive head as if coming out of a trance. It let out another earth-shaking roar and lunged forward. In that moment, Frank did the only thing he could think of. He threw the belt directly at the bear's face. The jingling projectile caught the bear by surprise, tangling around its snout. As the bear pawed at the offending object, Frank turned and hobbled as fast as he could towards the tree line. Pain shot through his entire body with each step, but fear and adrenaline propelled him forward. He could hear the bear's angry roars behind him, spurring him on despite the agony. As Frank reached the edge of the clearing, he risked a glance back. The bear had freed itself from the belt and was now charging towards him, covering ground at an alarming rate. "Oh shit!" Frank gasped, pushing himself to move faster. He plunged into the dense forest, branches whipping at his face as he stumbled through the underbrush. The sound of the bear crashing through the trees behind him filled his ears, along with the pounding of his own heart. Frank's lungs burned, his vision blurred with tears and blood from his head wound, but he kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to survive. As he ran, a desperate prayer formed in his mind. "Please, God, if you're listening, I promise I'll never play Santa again. Just let me live through this, please." The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees becoming a maze of shadows and snow. Frank had no idea where he was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between himself and the bear as possible. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, had to find help, or this cold, dark forest would become his final resting place. And so Frank Mallory, the reluctant mall Santa-turned-survivor, pushed on into the night, the sound of jingle bells and bear roars fading behind him as he ventured deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. Frank's lungs burned as he stumbled through the dense forest, each labored breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air. The sound of the bear's pursuit had faded, but he didn't dare stop. His Santa suit, once pristine and festive, now hung in tatters, snagging on branches and thorns as he pushed forward. "Keep moving, Frank," he wheezed to himself, his injured ankle screaming with every step. "You stop, you die." The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist with malevolent intent. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through Frank's battered body. He had lost all sense of direction, driven only by the primal need to survive. Suddenly, Frank's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him sprawling face-first into the snow. He lay there for a moment, the cold seeping into his bones, as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. "What were you thinking, you old fool?" he muttered, pushing himself up onto his elbows. "Playing Santa in the middle of bear country. Might as well have gift-wrapped yourself." As Frank struggled to his feet, a low growl froze him in place. Slowly, he turned his head, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. There, not 10 feet away, stood the grizzly bear. Its eyes gleamed with predatory intent, its massive form blocking any hope of escape. Frank's mind raced, searching desperately for a way out, but he knew deep down that his luck had finally run out. "Well, big fella," Frank said, his voice trembling. "Looks like you win this round." The bear rose to its full height, towering over Frank. In that moment, as he stared death in the face, Frank felt a strange calm wash over him. He thought of his late wife, Sarah, and wondered if he might see her soon. "I'm coming, honey," he whispered, closing his eyes as the bear's massive paw swung towards him. The impact was like being hit by a truck. Frank felt himself flying through the air, his world spinning in a kaleidoscope of pain and disorientation. He slammed into a tree trunk, the crack of breaking ribs audible even over the bear's roar. Frank crumpled to the ground, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Through blurred vision, he saw the bear advancing, its jaws open wide, ready to deliver the fatal bite. In that moment, driven by a surge of adrenaline and the will to live, Frank's hand closed around a thick branch lying in the snow. With every ounce of strength he had left, he swung it at the bear's face. The branch connected with a solid thwack, startling the bear and buying Frank a precious few seconds. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the screaming pain in every part of his body, and began to run again. "Come on, you son of a bitch," Frank growled through gritted teeth, his Santa hat long gone and his white hair matted with blood. "You want me? Come and get me." The bear, enraged by the attack, charged after Frank with renewed vigor. Its roars echoed through the forest, spurring Frank on despite the agony coursing through his body. As he ran, Frank's foot suddenly met empty air. He teetered on the edge of a steep slope, arms windmilling as he fought to keep his balance. But it was too late. With a cry of despair, Frank tumbled down the incline, rolling and bouncing over rocks and fallen logs. He came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and barely conscious. The world spun around him, and he could taste blood in his mouth. As he lay there trying to gather his wits, he heard the bear crashing down the slope after him. Frank tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He could only watch in horror as the bear approached, its eyes fixed on him with murderous intent. "This is it, old man," Frank thought, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. Mauled to death in a Santa suit, what a way to go. The bear reached Frank, its hot breath washing over him as it sniffed at its prey. Frank closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But instead of the expected pain, he felt something tugging at his arm. Frank's eyes snapped open to see the bear pawing at the sleeve of his Santa jacket. With a sickening rip, the sleeve tore away, taking a good chunk of Frank's flesh with it. The pain was indescribable. Frank screamed, the sound echoing through the forest and startling a flock of birds into flight. Blood poured from the wound, staining the snow crimson. In his agony, Frank's hand closed around something in the pocket of his ruined jacket. It was the sack of candy he had brought for Tom's children, somehow still intact after the ordeal. With the last of his strength, Frank pulled out a handful of candy canes and threw them at the bear's face. The plastic wrappers crinkled as they hit the bear's snout, the peppermint smell filling the air. The bear, momentarily distracted, pawed at the strange objects. It sniffed at the candy, its focus shifting away from Frank for a crucial moment. Seizing the opportunity, Frank began to drag himself away, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Every movement was agony, but the will to survive drove him on. "Come on, Frank," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little further, don't give up now." As he pulled himself along, Frank's hand brushed against something cold and hard. It was a small stream, its surface frozen over with a thin layer of ice. An idea formed in Frank's pain-addled mind. Using the last reserves of his strength, Frank smashed his fist through the ice. The shock of the frigid water was like a jolt of electricity, clearing his mind for a moment. The bear, having lost interest in the candy, turned its attention back to Frank. It lumbered towards him, its massive paws leaving deep imprints in the bloody snow. "Come on, you furry bastard," Frank growled, splashing water onto the snowy bank of the stream. "Just a little closer." As the bear stepped onto the wet snow, its foot slipped. The massive creature lost its balance, crashing to the ground with a roar of surprise and anger. Frank didn't wait to see what would happen next. He plunged into the icy stream, the cold water stealing his breath away. The current, though weak, was enough to carry his battered body downstream, away from the enraged bear. As he floated, barely conscious, Frank could hear the bear's roars fading into the distance. The icy water numbed his pain, but he knew he couldn't stay in it for long. Hypothermia would claim him if the bear didn't. With the last of his strength, Frank managed to pull himself onto the opposite bank of the stream. He lay there, shivering violently, his tattered Santa suit frozen to his body. "Merry fucking Christmas, Frank," he mumbled, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. As consciousness slipped away, Frank thought he heard a voice in the distance. But that was impossible, wasn't it? No one else could be out here in this frozen wilderness. The last thing Frank saw before the darkness took him was a beam of light cutting through the trees. Then mercifully, the pain and cold faded away. And Frank Mallory, the mall Santa who survived a bear attack, knew no more. The world came back to Frank in fragments. The crunch of snow, distant voices, and an overwhelming sense of cold that seemed to penetrate to his very bones. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind struggling to make sense of what had happened. "Over here! I found someone!" a voice called out, seeming to come from far away. Frank tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt frozen shut. He attempted to speak, to call for help, but all that came out was a weak groan. "Oh my God," the voice said. "Closer now. It's Santa Claus." Hands were on him then, gentle but insistent, checking for signs of life. Frank wanted to tell them about the bear, to warn them of the danger, but he couldn't form the words. "He's alive, but barely," another voice said. "Radio for emergency evac. We need to get him out of here now." Frank felt himself being lifted, the movement sending waves of pain through his battered body. He let out a cry of agony, his eyes finally fluttering open. "Easy there, buddy," the first voice said. Frank's vision cleared enough to see a young man in a park ranger uniform looking down at him with concern. "You're safe now. We're going to get you help." "Be bear," Frank managed to croak out, his voice barely above a whisper. The ranger's eyes widened. "A bear did this in December?" Frank nodded weakly, the simple movement causing his head to spin. "Must be one that didn't den up properly," the second ranger said. "Climate change is messing with their hibernation patterns. We'll need to alert the wildlife team." As they carried him through the forest, Frank drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain in his arm was excruciating, and he could feel warm blood soaking through the makeshift bandages the rangers had applied. "Stay with us, Santa," one of the rangers kept saying. "Help is on the way. Just hang on." Frank wanted to tell them he wasn't really Santa, that it was all a ridiculous mistake, but he didn't have the strength. Instead, he focused on staying awake, on fighting against the darkness that threatened to engulf him. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the air roused Frank from his stupor. He opened his eyes to see a rescue chopper descending into a small clearing, its spotlight illuminating the snowy landscape. "Over here!" the rangers called out, waving their arms to guide the helicopter. As they loaded Frank onto a stretcher, he caught a glimpse of himself reflected in one of the chopper's windows. His Santa suit was in tatters, stained with blood and frozen in places. His beard, the fake one from the costume, was gone, revealing his bruised and battered face. He looked less like jolly old Saint Nick, and more like a survivor of some horrific disaster. "What's your name, sir?" a paramedic asked as they secured him in the helicopter. "Frank," he managed to say. "Frank Mallory." "Okay, Frank," the paramedic said, attaching monitors to his chest. "You're going to be all right. We're taking you to Kalispell Regional Medical Center. Just try to stay awake for me, okay?" As the helicopter lifted off, Frank's thoughts drifted to Tom and his family. They would be wondering where he was, why Santa never showed up with the promised treats. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the pain in his ribs turned it into a groan. "Vitals are dropping," he heard someone say. "We need to move fast." The landscape blurred beneath them as the helicopter sped towards the hospital. Frank found himself thinking of Sarah, his late wife. He could almost hear her voice chiding him for his foolishness. "I know, honey," he thought. "I should have listened to you. Should have stayed home." "Frank," the paramedic's voice cut through his thoughts. "I need you to stay with me. Tell me about your family. Do you have kids?" Frank nodded weakly. "Two," he managed to say. "Grown now, living out of state." "That's good, Frank," the paramedic encouraged. "Tell me about them." As Frank struggled to form words, to tell this stranger about his children, he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to see them again, to hug them, to tell them he loved them. The thought gave him strength, a reason to keep fighting. "We're almost there, Frank," the paramedic said. "You're doing great. Just hold on a little longer." The helicopter began its descent, the lights of the hospital coming into view. Frank could hear a flurry of activity as they prepared for landing. As they touched down, Frank's world exploded into a cacophony of noise and movement. He was rushed from the helicopter, doctors and nurses swarming around him, calling out medical terms he didn't understand. "Multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding," one doctor said. "Left arm severely mauled. Signs of hypothermia," another added. Frank tried to follow what was happening, but the pain and exhaustion were overwhelming. As they wheeled him into the emergency room, the bright lights above seemed to blur and swirl. "Frank," a doctor said, leaning over him, "we're going to take good care of you, but I need you to fight, okay? Can you do that for me?" Frank nodded, summoning what little strength he had left. "I'll fight," he whispered. "Good man," the doctor said. "Now we're going to put you under for surgery. When you wake up, this will all be over." As the anesthesia mask was placed over his face, Frank had one last coherent thought. "Next year, I'm sticking to online shopping." Then, mercifully, the darkness took him, and Frank Mallory, the mall Santa who survived a bear attack, knew no more pain. In the hours that followed, as skilled surgeons worked to repair the damage done by the bear and the unforgiving wilderness, Frank's story began to spread, first among the hospital staff, then to local news outlets. By morning, The tale of the Santa Claus who battled a grizzly bear on Christmas Eve had gone viral. But Frank, deep in a healing sleep, knew nothing of his newfound fame. In his dreams, he was far away from the pain and the cold, sitting by a warm fire with Sarah, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. And for now, that was all that mattered. The first rays of dawn crept through the hospital window, casting a soft glow on Frank's battered face. His eyes fluttered open, consciousness returning in a haze of pain and confusion. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then, like a flood, the memories of the bear attack came rushing back. Frank tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it as pain shot through his body. He let out a groan, which alerted the nurse who had been checking his vitals. "Easy there, Mr. Mallory," she said, gently easing him back onto the pillow. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Try not to move too much." Frank's throat felt like sandpaper as he croaked out, "Water?" The nurse nodded, bringing a cup with a straw to his lips. The cool liquid was a blessing, soothing his parched throat. "Where am I?" Frank asked after a few sips. "You're in Kalispell Regional Medical Center," the nurse explained. "You were brought in last night by helicopter. Do you remember what happened?" Frank closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. "Bear," he muttered. "There was a bear." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "That's right. You're very lucky to be alive, Mr. Mallory. The doctors are calling it a miracle." Frank let out a weak chuckle that turned into a painful cough. "Doesn't feel like much of a miracle right now." As the nurse adjusted his IV, Frank took stock of his injuries. His left arm was heavily bandaged, and he could feel the tight wrapping of bandages around his chest. Every breath sent a twinge of pain through his ribs. "How bad is it?" he asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. The nurse's expression turned serious. "You've suffered some severe injuries, Mr. Mallory. Multiple lacerations, 4 broken ribs, a sprained ankle, and I'm afraid the bear did significant damage to your left arm. The doctors had to perform emergency surgery to save it, but..." She trailed off, and Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with his injuries. "But what?" he pressed. "There was extensive tissue and nerve damage," she explained gently. "The doctors did everything they could, but you may have limited use of that arm from now on." "I'm so sorry." Frank let the news sink in. He thought of all the years he'd spent behind the wheel of his truck, the strength in his arms that had never failed him. Now, in the twilight of his life, he'd been permanently marked by his encounter with the wild. "Well," he said after a long moment, his voice thick with emotion, "guess I won't be arm wrestling any bears anytime soon." The nurse smiled sadly at his attempt at humor. "The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your treatment plan. Is there anyone you'd like us to contact for you?" Frank thought of his children, living their own lives far away. He hated the idea of worrying them, of having them see him like this. "No," he said finally. "No, there's no one." As the nurse left, Frank was left alone with his thoughts. He stared out the window at the Montana landscape, the snow-covered peaks a stark reminder of the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life. The events of the past night felt like a surreal nightmare, yet the pain in his body was a constant reminder of its reality. A knock at the door roused him from his reverie. A tall man in a white coat entered, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Mallory," he said, his voice kind but professional. "I'm Dr. Stevenson. I was the lead surgeon on your case last night. How are you feeling?" Frank managed a wry smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly and lost." Dr. Stevenson nodded, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Well, from what I hear, you gave that bear a run for its money. You're one tough customer, Mr. Mallory." He proceeded to explain Frank's injuries in detail, using medical terms that Frank only half understood. The prognosis was sobering. Weeks of hospital stay, followed by months of physical therapy. The damage to his left arm was severe, and while they had managed to save it, full functionality was unlikely. As the doctor spoke, Frank's mind wandered to the bear. Had it survived? Was it still out there, a threat to others? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Stevenson addressed the issue. "The wildlife authorities have been notified," he said. "They're conducting a search of the area where you were found. It's unusual for a bear to be active this time of year, so they're taking it very seriously." Frank nodded, relief washing over him. At least some good might come from his ordeal. As Dr. Stevenson was wrapping up, there was another knock at the door. A man in a ranger uniform entered, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm Ranger Thompson. I was hoping I could ask Mr. Mallory a few questions about the incident if he's up for it." Dr. Stevenson looked at Frank, who nodded his assent. "All right," the doctor said, "but keep it brief. Mr. Mallory needs his rest." As the doctor left, Ranger Thompson took the vacant seat. "Mr. Mallory," he began, "first, let me say how glad we are that you survived. It's nothing short of miraculous." Frank grunted in acknowledgement, waiting for the questions to begin. "Now," the ranger continued, pulling out a notepad, "can you tell me exactly what happened out there? What were you doing in the forest, especially dressed as, well, as Santa Claus?" Frank sighed, realizing how ridiculous his story would sound. But he recounted the events as best he could. His job as a mall Santa, his ill-fated decision to surprise his friend's children, the encounter with the bear, and his desperate fight for survival. As he spoke, Frank could see the ranger's expression shift from skepticism to amazement. When he finished, Ranger Thompson shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Mallory," he said, "I've been a ranger for 20 years, and I've never heard anything quite like this. You're incredibly lucky to be alive." Frank nodded, feeling the weight of his ordeal settling on him. "Trust me," he said. "I know." As the ranger stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Just so you know," he said, "your story's already making the rounds. The local news is calling you the Santa who survived. You might be in for some attention once you're feeling better." Frank groaned inwardly at the thought. Fame was the last thing he wanted. All he desired now was to heal, to put this nightmare behind him. As the day wore on, Frank drifted in and out of sleep, his body demanding rest to heal. In his more lucid moments, he thought about the future. His life had changed irrevocably in a single night. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was alive, and for now, that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his hospital room, Frank Mallory, the reluctant mall Santa turned bear attack survivor, allowed himself a small smile. He had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had kept him alive in that frozen forest. With that thought, Frank closed his eyes, letting the beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital lull him into a healing sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now he had found his glimmer of hope. The crisp Montana air bit at Lisa and Mark's faces as they trudged through the snow-covered forest. The couple, avid hikers even in winter, had set out early that morning for a day trip in the wilderness outside Whitefish. "I still can't believe how quiet it is out here," Lisa said, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's like we're the only people in the world." Mark nodded, adjusting his backpack. "That's why I love coming out here. It's a nice break from—" He stopped mid-sentence, holding up a hand. Lisa froze, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. At first there was only silence, then, faintly, they heard what sounded like a groan carried on the wind. "Someone's out there," Lisa said, her eyes widening, "and they sound hurt." Without hesitation, the couple moved towards the sound, their hiking poles crunching in the snow. As they rounded a large boulder, they saw a sight that made them both gasp. There, lying half-submerged in a shallow creek, was a man dressed in the tattered remains of a Santa Claus costume. His white beard was matted with blood, and his left arm was a mess of torn flesh and fabric. "Oh my God," Lisa breathed, rushing forward. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. He mumbled something incoherent, his lips blue from the cold. Mark was already pulling out his emergency radio. "This is hiker Mark Thompson calling any park rangers or emergency services. We have a medical emergency. I repeat, we have a medical emergency." As Mark relayed their coordinates, Lisa carefully checked the man's vital signs, her wilderness first aid training kicking in. "He's alive, but barely," she called to Mark. "We need to get him out of this water now." Together, they gently lifted the man from the creek, careful not to jostle his injuries. As they moved him, the man let out a cry of pain that echoed through the forest. "Easy there, buddy," Mark said soothingly. "We've got you. Help is on the way." As they waited for rescue, Lisa and Mark did what they could to make the man comfortable. They wrapped him in emergency blankets from their packs and elevated his injured arm. "What do you think happened to him?" Lisa asked in a low voice. Mark shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but it looks like he tangled with something big. A bear, maybe. But in December?" The man stirred, his eyes opening again. This time they seemed a bit clearer. "Bear," he croaked out, confirming Mark's suspicion. "A bear did this?" Lisa asked. Lisa, incredulous. "What's your name, sir?" "Frank," the man managed to say before a fit of coughing overtook him. "Okay, Frank," Mark said, patting his shoulder gently. "Just take it easy. We've called for help. You're going to be all right." As if on cue, they heard the distant thrum of helicopter blades. Mark stood waving his bright orange safety flag to guide the rescue chopper. The forest clearing erupted into a flurry of activity as park rangers and paramedics descended from the helicopter. They quickly assessed Frank's condition, their faces grave as they took in the extent of his injuries. Multiple lacerations, severe hypothermia, possible internal bleeding, one paramedic rattled off as they prepared Frank for transport. As they loaded Frank onto a stretcher, his eyes suddenly widened in panic. "The bear," he gasped out. "It's still out there." The lead ranger turned to Mark and Lisa. "Did either of you see any sign of a bear?" They shook their heads. "No," Mark said, "but we weren't really looking. We were focused on helping him." The ranger nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "We'll send out a search team immediately. A bear being active this time of year is highly unusual and potentially dangerous." As the paramedics secured Frank in the helicopter, Lisa and Mark watched, still processing the surreal events of the morning. "Will he be okay?" Lisa asked one of the paramedics. The man's face was serious, but not without hope. "He's in rough shape, but he's a fighter. The fact that he survived out here all night is nothing short of miraculous." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Frank to the hospital in Kalispell, Mark and Lisa stood in the clearing, the events of the morning settling over them like the fresh snow on the trees. "I can't believe it," Lisa said, shaking her head. "We came out for a quiet hike and ended up saving Santa Claus from a bear attack." Mark chuckled, the tension of the rescue finally breaking. "Well, I guess we're on the nice list for life now." As they gathered their gear, preparing to head back to their car, a park ranger approached them. "We can't thank you enough for what you did today," he said earnestly. "If you hadn't found him when you did, well, let's just say you two are real heroes." Lisa and Mark exchanged a glance, the weight of their actions sinking in. They had set out that morning for a simple hike and had ended up saving a man's life. "We're just glad we could help," Mark said. "Will you let us know how he's doing?" The ranger nodded. "Of course. We'll need to take your statements about what happened here today, and I'm sure once he's recovered, Frank will want to thank you himself." As they made their way back through the forest, Lisa and Mark walked in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the morning's events. "You know," Lisa said finally, "I keep thinking about Frank out here all alone, fighting for his life. It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?" Mark nodded, squeezing her hand. "It sure does. Makes you appreciate every moment." As they emerged from the tree line, they could see their car parked at the trailhead. The world beyond the forest seemed unchanged, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the wilderness. But for Lisa and Mark, and for Frank Mallory, the Santa who survived, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The couple drove back to Whitefish in thoughtful silence, the events of the morning replaying in their minds. They knew they had been part of something extraordinary, a rescue that bordered on the miraculous. As the town came into view, Lisa turned to Mark. "Next Christmas," she said with a small smile, "let's just stay home and watch It's a Wonderful Life, okay?" Mark laughed, the tension of the day finally breaking. "Deal," he said, taking her hand. "But you have to admit this is one Christmas hike we'll never forget." As they drove into town, the local news was already beginning to buzz with the story of the Santa Claus rescued from a bear attack in the Montana wilderness. Little did they know their quiet hike had become part of a tale that would be told and retold for years to come. The steady beep of medical monitors filled the hospital room as Frank Mallory slowly opened his eyes. The harsh fluorescent lights made him wince, and for a moment, He couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then, like a flood, the memories came rushing back. The bear, the fight for survival, the rescue. He let out a groan, the sound catching the attention of a nurse who was checking his vitals. "Welcome back, Mr. Mallory," she said with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" Frank tried to speak, but his throat was parched. The nurse quickly offered him some water, which he gratefully sipped through a straw. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Frank finally managed to croak out, "or mauled by a bear." The nurse's smile turned sympathetic. "Well, you're not far off. The doctor will be in shortly to discuss your condition. You've been through quite an ordeal." As if on cue, a tall man in a white coat entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Mallory," he said, his voice professional but kind. "I'm Dr. Stevenson. I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" Frank attempted a wry smile, which turned into a grimace of pain. "Like death warmed over, Doc. What's the damage?" Dr. Stevenson pulled up a chair next to Frank's bed, his expression serious. "Mr. Mallory, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You've suffered severe injuries, multiple lacerations across your body, 4 broken ribs, a sprained ankle, and—" He paused, his eyes flicking to Frank's heavily bandaged left arm. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "And what, Doc?" The doctor took a deep breath. "The bear did significant damage to your left arm. We had to perform emergency surgery to save it, but I'm afraid there's been extensive tissue and nerve damage. You may have limited use of that arm from now on." The news hit Frank like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, trying to process what he'd just heard. His left arm, the same arm that had steered his truck across the country countless times, that had lifted his children when they were small. Now, it might never be the same. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mallory," Dr. Stevenson said softly. "I know this is a lot to take in. We'll do everything we can to help you regain as much function as possible through physical therapy. But I want you to be prepared for a long recovery process." Frank nodded numbly, his mind reeling. What about the bear?" he asked, suddenly remembering the danger he'd left behind in the forest. "The wildlife authorities have been notified," the doctor assured him. "They're conducting a search of the area where you were found. It's unusual for a bear to be active this time of year, so they're taking it very seriously." Just then, there was a knock at the door. A man in a ranger uniform entered, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm Ranger Thompson. I was hoping I could ask Mr. Mallory a few questions about the incident if he's up for it." Dr. Stevenson looked at Frank, who nodded his assent. "All right," the doctor said, "but keep it brief. Mr. Mallory needs his rest." As the doctor left, Ranger Thompson took the vacant seat. "Mr. Mallory," he began, "first let me say how glad we are that you survived. It's nothing short of miraculous." Frank grunted in acknowledgement, waiting for the questions to begin. "Now," the ranger continued, pulling out a notepad, "can you tell me exactly what happened out there? What were you doing in the forest, especially dressed as Santa Claus?" Frank sighed, realizing how ridiculous his story would sound. But he recounted the events as best he could. His job as a mall Santa, his ill-fated decision to surprise his friend's children, the encounter with the bear, and his desperate fight for survival. As he spoke, Frank could see the ranger's expression shift from skepticism to amazement. When he finished, Ranger Thompson shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Mallory," he said, "I've been a ranger for 20 years, and I've never heard anything quite like this. You're incredibly lucky to be alive." Frank nodded, feeling the weight of his ordeal settling on him. "Trust me," he said. "I know." As the ranger stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Just so you know," he said, "your story's already making the rounds. The local news is calling you the Santa who survived. You might be in for some attention once you're feeling better." Frank groaned inwardly at the thought. Fame was the last thing he wanted. All he desired now was to heal, to put this nightmare behind him. As the day wore on, a steady stream of medical staff came and went, checking Frank's vitals, changing his bandages, and administering pain medication. In the rare moments of quiet, Frank found his thoughts drifting to his friend Tom and his family. They must be wondering what had happened to him. Late in the afternoon, there was another knock at the door. To Frank's surprise, Tom himself walked in. his face a mixture of relief and guilt. "Frank," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "My God, I'm so sorry. If I had known." Frank held up his good hand, stopping Tom mid-sentence. "It's not your fault, Tom. I'm the idiot who decided to play Santa in bear country." Tom pulled up a chair, shaking his head. "When you didn't show up, we thought maybe you'd gotten stuck in the snow or something. We had no idea." "Frank, I can't believe you survived out there." "Neither can I," Frank admitted. "It's all a bit of a blur, to be honest." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened hanging between them. Finally, Tom spoke again. "The kids are worried sick about you," he said. "They heard about Santa getting attacked by a bear, and they're convinced it's their fault for asking you to come." Frank felt a pang of guilt. "Tell them it's not their fault," he said firmly. "And tell them Santa's tough, he'll be okay." Tom nodded, a small smile breaking through his concerned expression. "You know, Frank, you really are something. Most men your age are content to sit in a rocking chair, but you go toe-to-toe with a grizzly and live to tell the tale." Frank chuckled, then winced as the movement sent pain through his ribs. "Yeah, well, next year I think I'll stick to online shopping." As Tom left, promising to visit again soon, Frank was left alone with his thoughts. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in. His life had changed irrevocably in a single night. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was alive. And for now, that was enough. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his hospital room, Frank Mallory, the reluctant mall Santa turned bear attack survivor, allowed himself a small smile. He had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had kept him alive in that frozen forest. With that thought, Frank closed his eyes, letting the beep of monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital lull him into a healing sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he had survived the aftermath of his incredible ordeal. 2 weeks after his harrowing encounter with the grizzly bear, Frank Mallory stood at the entrance of Kalispell Regional Medical Center, leaning heavily on a cane. The automatic doors slid open, and a gust of cold Montana air rushed in, making him shiver despite his thick coat. "You sure you're ready for this, Mr. Mallory?" Nurse Jenkins asked, concern evident in her voice. She had been Frank's primary caregiver during his hospital stay, and had grown fond of the tough old man with a wry sense of humor. Frank nodded, his jaw set with determination. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, his voice gruff but tinged with uncertainty. "Can't spend the rest of my life in a hospital bed, can I?" Nurse Jenkins smiled sympathetically. "Just remember to take it easy, and don't forget your follow-up appointments with Dr. Stevenson and the physical therapist." "Don't worry," Frank assured her. "I've got it all written down. I may be old, but I'm not senile yet." With a final wave goodbye, Frank stepped out into the world. His friend Tom was waiting in the parking lot, engine running and heater on full blast. "Welcome back to the land of the living, you old coot." Tom greeted him as he helped Frank into the passenger seat. Frank grunted in response, wincing as he settled into the seat. Every movement was still a reminder of his ordeal. His left arm, encased in a cast and supported by a sling, throbbed dully. As they drove through the streets of Kalispell, Frank found himself tensing at every tree they passed. The rational part of his mind knew he was safe in the car, but the memory of the bear's roar seemed to echo in every shadow. "You okay, Frank?" Tom asked, noticing his friend's discomfort. Frank forced a smile. "Yeah, just taking it all in. Feels like I've been away for a lifetime." They pulled up to Frank's small house on the outskirts of town. It looked exactly as he had left it that fateful night, yet somehow it felt different, foreign. Tom helped Frank inside, setting his bag down in the living room. "I stocked your fridge with some basics," he said, "and Mary made you a casserole. It's in the freezer." "Thanks, Tom," Frank said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "For everything." Tom clapped him gently on his good shoulder. "That's what friends are for. You need anything, day or night, you call me, got it?" Frank nodded, suddenly feeling very tired. After Tom left, he sank into his old recliner, the familiar comfort of it a stark contrast to the hospital bed he'd been confined to for weeks. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Frank found himself straining to hear, What? The growl of a bear? The beeping of hospital monitors? He shook his head, trying to clear away the thoughts. That night, sleep proved elusive. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, had Frank jolting awake, his heart racing. When he did manage to doze off, his dreams were filled with gnashing teeth and gleaming claws. The next morning, Frank awoke feeling more exhausted than when he'd gone to bed. He shuffled to the kitchen, fumbling one-handed with the coffee maker. As he waited for the coffee to brew, his eyes fell on the calendar hanging on the wall. December 24th was circled in red, the day of the attack. It felt like a lifetime ago. A sudden urge to tell someone, anyone, about what had happened overtook him. Frank grabbed his phone and dialed the number for the local ranger station. "Flathead National Forest Ranger Station, how can I help you?" A cheerful voice answered. Yes," Frank began, suddenly feeling foolish. "This is Frank Mallory. I was attacked by a bear a few weeks ago. I wanted to report it officially." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, Mr. Mallory. Yes, we've heard about your incident. I'm glad you're well enough to call. We actually have your case on file already, based on the initial report from your rescuers." Frank felt a mix of relief and frustration. "So, what happens now? Is someone going to do something about the bear?" The ranger's voice turned sympathetic. "Mr. Mallory, we've conducted thorough searches of the area where you were found. We haven't been able to locate the bear, and with the recent heavy snowfall, any tracks have been obscured. I'm afraid there's not much more we can do at this point." Frank's heart sank. But it's still out there. What if it attacks someone else?" "I understand your concern, sir," the ranger said. "We're keeping an eye on the situation, and we've posted warnings in the area. But bear attacks, especially this time of year, are extremely rare. Your case was unusual." After a few more minutes of unsatisfying conversation, Frank hung up. He felt deflated. The danger he had faced, the terror he had experienced, seemed to have been reduced to a mere footnote, a quirk of nature. As the days passed, Frank struggled to adjust to his new reality. Simple tasks like getting dressed or preparing meals became frustrating ordeals with only one fully functional arm. Physical therapy sessions left him exhausted and often discouraged at the slow progress. One afternoon, about a week after returning home, Frank decided to venture out to the local supermarket. He needed to feel normal again, to do something as mundane as grocery shopping. As he walked down the aisles, leaning on his cart for support, he could feel eyes on him. People whispered as he passed, some pointing discreetly. His story had made the local news, and in a small town like Whitefish, everyone knew everyone else's business. Frank tried to ignore the attention, focusing on his shopping list. As he reached for a can of soup, struggling a bit with his good arm, he heard a child's voice behind him. "Mommy, is that the Santa who fought the bear?" Frank froze, the can slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The sound of it hitting the linoleum seemed to echo through the store, and suddenly, all he could hear was the roar of the bear. All he could see were its gleaming teeth coming at him. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" Frank blinked, coming back to reality. A concerned store employee was standing next to him, the dropped can in her hand. He realized he was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. I'm fine," he managed to say, his voice shaky. Just lost my grip there." The employee looked unconvinced but nodded, placing the can in his cart. "Let me know if you need any help, sir." Frank nodded, not trusting himself to speak again. He abandoned his shopping, leaving the half-filled cart in the aisle as he hurried out of the store as fast as his still healing body would allow. Back in his truck, Frank sat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm his racing heart. The panic attack had come out of nowhere, leaving him shaken and disoriented. "Get a grip, old man," he muttered to himself. "It's over. You're safe now." But as he drove home, every tree along the road seemed to loom menacingly, and every shadow held the potential for danger. The bear might be gone, but its presence still haunted Frank's every waking moment. That evening, as Frank sat in his living room, the TV droning in the background, he found himself reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept for special occasions. He poured himself a generous glass, hoping the alcohol might quiet the constant replay of the attack in his mind. As he sipped the burning liquid, his eyes fell on a framed photo on the mantel. It was a picture of him in his younger days, standing proudly next to his truck. He remembered the feeling of freedom, the open road ahead of him, the confidence that came with youth and health. Now here he sat jumping at shadows and unable to even go grocery shopping without having a panic attack. The contrast between the man in the photo and the man he had become was stark and painful. A sudden anger welled up inside him. Anger at the bear, at the wilderness that had nearly claimed his life, at his own foolishness for putting himself in that situation. With a cry of frustration, Frank hurled his glass at the wall, watching it shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sound of breaking glass seemed to snap something inside him. Frank broke down, tears streaming down his weathered face as he sobbed uncontrollably. All the fear, pain, and helplessness he had been holding back came pouring out. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, crying like he hadn't since he was a child. When the tears finally subsided, Frank felt drained but somehow lighter, as if he had purged some of the darkness that had been clouding his soul. Wiping his eyes, Frank slowly got to his feet. He looked at the mess of broken glass and spilled whiskey, then at his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him was battered and scarred, but he was alive. He had survived. With a deep breath, Frank went to get a broom. As he cleaned up the broken glass, he made a decision. He couldn't let this experience define him. He had faced death and come out the other side. Now, he had to learn to live again. The next morning, Frank woke early. For the first time since the attack, he hadn't been plagued by nightmares. He got dressed, made himself a strong cup of coffee, and sat down at his kitchen table with a notepad. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Things to do." Then, slowly but with growing determination, he began to list out goals for himself. Small things at first. Go for a walk around the block, call the kids, finish a grocery shopping trip. But as the list grew, so did his ambition. Return to physical therapy with a positive attitude, volunteer at the local community center, and finally, take a short hike in the spring. The last item made his hand tremble slightly, but he forced himself to write it down. He knew that if he let the fear control him, if he never set foot in the wilderness again, then the bear would have won after all. As Frank looked at his list, he felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was Frank Mallory, the man who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. He had survived the wild. He could survive this too. With newfound resolve, Frank picked up his phone and dialed his daughter's number. As it rang, he looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape. The world outside still held dangers, but it also held beauty and the promise of new beginnings. "Hello?" His daughter's voice came through the speaker. "Hey, sweetheart," Frank said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "It's Dad. I've got quite a story to tell you." As Frank began to recount his experience, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew that the memory of the attack would always be with him, a part of his story now. But it didn't have to be the end of his story. In fact, Frank realized as he talked with his daughter, it could be the beginning of a new chapter, one where he appreciated every moment, faced his fears, and lived life to the fullest. The bear had taken much from Frank Mallory, but it hadn't taken his spirit. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. Months had passed since Frank Mallory's harrowing encounter with the grizzly bear in the Montana wilderness. Spring had come and gone, and the warm days of summer were fading into the crisp air of early autumn. The physical scars of his ordeal had begun to heal, the angry red lines fading to silvery streaks across his skin. But the mental scars, the ones invisible to the eye, still lingered. Frank sat in his living room, staring out the window at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He'd made progress over the past months, slowly reclaiming pieces of his life that the bear had torn away. But full recovery remained elusive, always just out of reach. The sound of the phone ringing jolted Frank from his reverie. He reached for it with his good arm, his left still weaker than it had been before the attack. "Hello?" he answered, his voice gruff from disuse. "Mr. Mallory, this is Dr. Stevenson. I'm calling to follow up on your last appointment." Frank sighed. He'd been avoiding thinking about his latest checkup. "Yeah, Doc." What's the verdict? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Well, Mr. Mallory, physically, you're making excellent progress. Your left arm's range of motion has improved significantly, and the nerve damage seems to be healing better than we initially expected. But, Frank prompted, sensing there was more. Dr. Stevenson cleared his throat. But I'm concerned about your mental state. Frank, you mentioned you're still having nightmares, experiencing anxiety in open spaces. Have you considered talking to someone about this? A therapist specializing in trauma could be very helpful. Frank's jaw clenched. I appreciate the concern, Doc, but I'm fine. Just need more time, that's all. After a few more minutes of gentle but persistent encouragement from Dr. Stevenson, Frank hung up the phone. He knew the doctor meant well, but the thought of spilling his guts to a stranger made him uncomfortable. He was Frank Mallory, for crying out loud. He'd driven big rigs across the country for decades, faced all kinds of dangers on the road. He could handle this on his own. As evening approached, Frank decided to take a walk. He'd been pushing himself to venture outside more often, trying to reclaim the world beyond his four walls. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, his steps cautious but determined. The streets of Whitefish were quiet as Frank made his way through the neighborhood. He nodded to a few passers-by, still self-conscious about the way some people looked at him, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. His story had become something of a local legend, the Santa who survived, still a topic of conversation months later. As Frank rounded a corner, he found himself facing the edge of the forest that bordered the town. He stopped abruptly, his heart rate quickening. The trees seemed to loom larger, darker, more menacing than they had just moments ago. It's just trees, Frank muttered to himself, clenching his fists. Nothing but wood and leaves. But as he stood there, the wind picked up, rustling through the branches. The sound sent a shiver down Frank's spine, too reminiscent of that night in the wilderness. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard a low growl carried on the breeze. Frank turned and hurried back the way he'd come, his breath coming in short gasps. By the time he reached his house, he was nearly running. He slammed the door behind him, leaning against it as he tried to calm his racing heart. Get a grip, old man, he chastised himself, angry at his own fear. It's all in your head. But even as he said it, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. He spent the rest of the evening with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. That night, the nightmares came again. Frank found himself back in the forest, the bear's hot breath on his neck, its roar filling his ears. He thrashed in his sleep, tangling himself in the bedsheets until he woke with a strangled cry. Drenched in sweat, Frank stumbled to the bathroom. He splashed cold water on his face, then looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him seemed older, more haggard than he remembered. This has to stop, Frank said to his reflection. You can't keep living like this. The next morning, Frank made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Dr. Stevenson had given him for a trauma therapist. It was time to face his fears head-on. A week later, Frank found himself sitting in a comfortable office, facing Dr. Laura Chen, a kind-faced woman with a calm demeanor. So, Mr. Mallory, Dr. Chen began, why don't you tell me what brought you here today? Frank took a deep breath. I guess I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of letting what happened control my life. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. That's a very brave first step, Mr. Mallory. Can you tell me more about how the attack has affected your daily life? Over the next hour, Frank found himself opening up more than he had to anyone since the attack. He talked about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the way he'd become a virtual recluse in his own home. To his surprise, it felt good to finally voice these feelings. What you're experiencing is a normal response to trauma, Dr. Chen explained. Your brain is trying to protect you from a perceived threat. Our job is to help your brain understand that the danger has passed. As the session ended, Dr. Chen gave Frank some breathing exercises to try when he felt anxious. Remember, Mr. Mallory, recovery is a process. Be patient with yourself. Over the next few weeks, Frank continued his therapy sessions and gradually began to feel more in control. He started taking longer walks, even managing to skirt the edge of the forest without having a full-blown panic attack. But still, There were moments when the fear would grip him unexpectedly. One evening, as Frank was watching TV, a nature documentary came on. The sight of a grizzly bear fishing in a stream sent Frank into a cold sweat. He fumbled for the remote, changing the channel with shaking hands. "Damn it," he muttered, angry at himself for the reaction. He was about to turn off the TV entirely when something caught his eye. It was a commercial for the local mall, advertising their Christmas festivities. And there, in the center of the screen, was Santa Claus. Frank froze, a flood of memories washing over him. He remembered the weight of the Santa suit, the jingle of the bells, the excitement he'd felt as he set out to surprise his friends' children. It all seemed like a lifetime ago. Without really knowing why, Frank found himself reaching for his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Whitefish Mountain Mall, this is Sarah speaking. How can I help you?" Frank cleared his throat. "Sarah? It's Frank. Frank Mallory." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Frank, oh my goodness, how are you? We've all been so worried." I'm doing better," Frank said, surprised to find he meant it. "Listen, Sarah, I was wondering, do you still need a Santa for the mall this year?" The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Frank," Sarah said slowly, "are you sure? After everything that happened?" Frank took a deep breath. "I'm sure, Sarah. I think I need to do this. To prove to myself that I can." There was another pause. Then Sarah's voice came back, warm and supportive. "Well, Frank, as it happens, we haven't found anyone yet. The job's yours if you want it." As Frank hung up the phone, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. Was he really ready for this? But he knew, deep down, that this was a step he needed to take. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Frank dug out his old Santa suit, had it cleaned and repaired. He practiced his ho-ho-ho in the mirror, trying to recapture the jolly spirit he'd had before the attack. Finally, the day arrived. Frank stood in the back room of the mall, adjusting his fake beard and trying to calm his nerves. Sarah appeared at his side, concern etched on her face. "You sure about this, Frank? No one would blame you if you changed your mind." Frank took a deep breath, squared his shoulders. "I'm sure, Sarah. It's time to take back Christmas." As Frank stepped out into the mall's central courtyard, the sound of jingle bells filled the air. For a moment he froze, the sound catapulting him back to that night in the forest. But then he heard something else, the excited squeals of children, the cheerful holiday music playing over the speakers. Frank made his way to the big red chair, settling into it with a smile that felt only slightly forced. "Ho, ho, ho!" he boomed, surprised at how natural it felt. "Merry Christmas!" The first few children approached cautiously, but soon Frank found himself falling into the familiar rhythm. He listened to Christmas wishes, posed for photos, and handed out candy canes. With each interaction, he felt a little more of his old self returning. As the day wore on, Frank began to relax. The fear that had been his constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by the simple joy of bringing happiness to others. Near the end of his shift, a young boy climbed into his lap. The child looked up at Frank with wide eyes and asked, "Santa, are you scared of bears?" Frank felt his heart skip a beat. For a moment, he was back in the forest, the bear's roar echoing in his ears. But then he looked down at the child's innocent face and found himself smiling. "Well," Frank said, his voice gentle, "sometimes bears can be scary. But you know what? Santa is very brave and he has lots of friends to help him. So even if he gets scared sometimes, he knows he'll be okay." The boy nodded solemnly, then gave Frank a big hug before hopping down. As Frank watched him go, he realized something profound. The bear had taken much from him, but it hadn't taken everything. He was still here, still able to bring joy to others, still able to face his fears. That evening, as Frank drove home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The forest that bordered the road no longer seemed as threatening. It was just trees and shadows, nothing more. As he pulled into his driveway, Frank thought he heard a distant sound, something between a growl and a roar. For a moment, his heart raced. But then he took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Chen's exercises. "It's just the wind," he said aloud, his voice steady. "Just the wind in the trees." Frank got out of his car and looked up at the star-filled sky. The world was still a dangerous place, full of unexpected challenges, but he had survived. He had faced his fears, and he would continue to do so, one day at a time. As he unlocked his front door, the jingle of keys reminiscent of his Santa bells, Frank Mallory smiled. The bear might still haunt his memories, but it no longer controlled his life. He had taken back his story, and in doing so, he had taken back himself. Frank stepped inside,